barrister coach Catherine Brown to our webinar this afternoon. Catherine practiced as a barrister for nearly 15 years at King's Chambers in Manchester and brings with her all of that experience into her coaching practice, where she trains barristers and other professionals. Her business is known as Skillful Conversation Limited, and since leaving the bar, Catherine has worked globally as a trainer and coach, founding this company in 2018. As a trainer, Cath specialises in helping others with their confidence and their communication skills, and has developed workshops very much like this one on various topics such as managing difficult conversations and fighting back against imposter syndrome. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Cath, who will be leading this webinar. I will say that we will have some time for questions at the end. You can do this by writing a comment or writing in the private chat, or even being brave and coming online as well. I'm very happy to let people share their videos and speak to Cath directly. So Cath, thank you so much, and I'm going to shut up and pass on to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sure everybody is quite hot. Please do have lots of water available. Don't melt. And you might want also to have pen and paper, perhaps, or maybe make notes on your phone. I am going to give you some thinking to do. Essentially, what I've done here is compressed what can be up to a 3-hour workshop with lots of people sharing experiences, etc., into a webinar format and into 1 hour. So don't worry, you're not here for 3. We're going to try and keep this to about 50 minutes and leave lots of time for questions. But I've included in the deck, and I will include in the pack that we'll share afterwards, all the content, so that if we don't get through all of those tasks today, which would be impossible, then you can think about some of them for a bit longer in the future. I don't think I need to add any more to that introductory slide. I am a coach. I work with all sorts of people, but my real passion is thinking about what I wish I'd have had at the bar, I suppose. So thinking about coaching and training in that space. Let's talk, though. The reason we're all here is about imposter syndrome. And just to give you a little bit of background, I do still meet people who don't know what this is. I am pleased for them, frankly. Sometimes when I tell them what it is, they think, oh, you know, I do know that. I just didn't know it had a name. So it was first published about in the late 70s, as you can see there. It's believed to affect up to 70% of both women and men. And I think that's quite an interesting point to think about. If you do a study where you just ask people if they experience imposter syndrome and you explain what it is, then in a general study, women are much more likely to say yes than men. However, if you look at what people share in coaching or in therapy or in one-to-ones, that's where we get the impression that the figures are much more even than we might think. And what we're really talking about is something a bit more specific than just a lack of confidence, although hopefully some of what we share, think about and discuss today will apply to a more general lack of confidence. But imposter syndrome itself is very much that feeling that you have got somewhere by mistake, by accident, that you are somewhere you don't belong, that you're there through some clerical error, and that someday, probably soon, you will be found out. Somebody will say, hang on a minute, they're not good enough. And in the spirit of open sharing, I will just mention that when I did my pupillage interview at King's, it's one of the shortest interviews I've still ever done. And it ended up with 2 silks having a very heated discussion with each other and me not doing very much at all. And therefore, when I received the offer from King's back in '99, last century. I thought, this must be a mistake. It must be a mistake. I'll turn up and they'll think, oh no, we didn't mean to click that button for that person. This is an error. And even when I went to hand in my notice to my then head of chambers 14, 15 years after that, I thought, oh, this is when they'll own up. This is when they'll say it was all a terrible mistake. But nobody's owned up to it yet. So perhaps it wasn't. And I will share some quotes shortly from people so that you know that you are in good company if this is something which affects you. I have indicated there some issues that are linked, because I suppose feeling every so often that you're in the wrong place might not be too much of a burden to bear. But what tends to happen is that sufferers from imposter syndrome, and it can come and go, it can vary throughout your careers, but it can lead to increased stress, perfectionism, feeling you've got to go that extra mile, that you've got to prove yourself, that you've got to work to a higher standard. That can be exhausting. Just thinking about that feels a bit exhausting. And it can also potentially stand in the way of a natural progression through the ranks of whatever profession. Maybe it will potentially put a barrister off applying for silk or applying to go on the bench. Perhaps it will even prevent you from getting involved with a recruitment committee or an exec committee. It can perhaps be one of the ways in which we sometimes stand in our own way, can be perhaps our own worst enemy. So if you're feeling any of those things, that you're working harder than others, to feel like you're doing the same, if you are perhaps holding yourself back, then the strategies we're going to share next might be hopefully will be helpful for you. And when I was preparing this shortened version, I thought there are really two things I really want to get across. So I'm going to start with those. One, as I've already touched on, and I will share some quotes about shortly, is that you're not on your own. I can assure you, as somebody who coaches, trains, goes into workplaces, works with very senior people. I work with directors, I work with general counsel, and I know that even though you won't see this always in those people, and it won't be present in all of them, I think that 70% figure is quite a good estimate. So please, if you take nothing else from this hour together, please know that you are not alone. And the second key point, I think, is to recognise it as something of a reality. If it's something that could affect 70% of us at a given point, and if you think about what it means, I'm not good enough to be here, then the reality is it's affecting people who are in good, prestigious, prominent positions. Much more likely to affect the talented and the gifted, those who have pushed themselves, those who've stretched themselves, those who've perhaps been a little bit lucky along the way. It is very unlikely to affect people who operate solely within their comfort zone. If you're ticking along, doing what comes easily to you, not putting yourself under any undue stress, you are unlikely to feel fraudulent. You might feel bored, but you are unlikely to feel fraudulent. So you have to have achieved something, I've said there, to get into the position where you believe you don't deserve it. So it's always a good idea, I think, to have in your toolkit, I often talk about a self-coaching toolkit. One of the things I wish I'd had at the bar, it is often a good idea to be able to reframe scenarios. The most common example that's usually given is to reframe any fear or anxiety as excitement. And I think in respect of imposter syndrome, the most obvious reframe is to see it as a mark of having achieved, a mark of having stretched yourself and pushed yourself. It's a sign of success. Now, I don't want to just say it's all fluffy and lovely. As I mentioned, it can have some negative impacts, stress, perfectionism, etc. But I think if what's really troubling you is its existence rather than its impact, then reframing it can help. I think also something that works for me won't work for everybody. None of these strategies are one size fits all. But I think also what works for me is to recognise or to believe, and I do believe, that it is better than the opposite. The opposite syndrome, if it is indeed a syndrome, doesn't get quite as much press, but it was recognised as Dunning-Kruger syndrome, which is a cognitive bias whereby people with low ability, expertise or experience in a certain area, a certain task, a certain degree of knowledge tend to overestimate their ability or their knowledge. And perhaps some of us might be able to think of people we've come across who suffer from that, who overestimate their brilliance, who overestimate even their competence. And I would rather be a little modest. I would rather be a bit realistic. So for some of you, that might be a way to think about it, to reframe it as a sign that you are at least showing some self-awareness, showing a degree of modesty or humility. There is, just as an aside, I went to a talk a couple of years ago now by a man who had written a book called, and this is probably a safe space to say this, although I know that I'm being streamed, Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders? And the title, I suppose, is potentially could be described as clickbait in itself. But the idea was that in many modern workplaces, possibly in modern politics also, that confidence is confused with competence. And those who talk the best game perhaps achieve things which are really, when we think about their abilities, in fact, beyond them. And that's an idea we might perhaps come back to. But I think having a good handle, we're going to talk about an evidence-based approach shortly, having a good handle on your own competence, I think is a good thing. It's a reframe, but it's a reframe that I believe in. And just to emphasise that second key point, that you're not alone, I've gathered together, I think, 4 quotes from the great and the good who have talked about this feeling or something similar to this feeling in the public eye. And here's one. I will just read it in case anybody's got any accessibility issues with the slides, and then I will tell you who it is. You will know this person probably, so have a think. When am I going to be found out? That's been a perpetual thing at the back of one's mind. When I went from primary school to a girls' high school, am I now going to be found out and be the bottom of the class? When I go from high school to Cambridge, am I now going to be found out and be the bottom of class? That is Lady Baroness Hale, former member of the Supreme Court. I think I've got that right, haven't I? I'm not current. But astonishing achievements, trailblazing throughout her career, but sometimes feeling that she would be found out. And I'll share a separate quote from Lady Hale later on, which shares perhaps what she does about that. Here's somebody else you will know in the public eye, but might be a bit harder to guess, I think. Again, I'll just give you this one in full. I still have a little bit of imposter syndrome. It never goes away. But you're actually listening to me. It doesn't go away, that feeling that you shouldn't take me that seriously. What do I know? I share that with you because we all have doubts in our abilities about our power and what that power is. And the power might be the clue there, because it's a bit of a theme for that speaker, who is Michelle Obama. I'll share another flip side from Michelle Obama later on as well. This is a quote from a man to address that gender imbalance. In the earlier quotes, the exaggerated esteem in which my life work is held makes me very ill at ease. I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler. Didn't mean to, but I've conned everybody, is what they're saying there, really. And that is Albert Einstein. And then just one more before I get you to do some thinking. This is, again, a person, a woman, a very high profile. Really making a good point here. It's almost like the better I do, the more my feeling of inadequacy actually increases. Because I'm just going, any moment, someone's going to find out I'm a total fraud and that I don't deserve any of what I've achieved. I can't possibly live up to what everyone thinks I am and what everyone's expectations of me are. It's weird. Sometimes success can be incredibly validating, but sometimes it can be incredibly unnerving and throw your balance off a bit. Because you're trying to reconcile how you feel about yourself with how the rest of the world perceives you. And I think that idea that other people will perceive you differently, other people will have a better, perhaps more realistic sense of your abilities, is something that can feed into an evidence-based approach to this. Okay, so you're not alone, you're in excellent company. And I'm just going to slow down and give you a little bit of thinking time, a little bit of time to capture some thoughts on these questions. These sorts of questions you can think about. I think reflecting on your position, your feelings, your actions in all sorts of areas is important. So I won't ask anybody to share these, but it might be that if people come on later with a question, that you want to share some of this. So just as a little bit of practice of reflection, to give you a slight break from my voice and get you to think, have a think about what imposter syndrome means to you. And then a couple of questions about impact. How has it impacted you in the past? Have you perhaps held yourself back? Have you perhaps worked too hard, made yourself ill, gone too far into certain exam subjects perhaps? And possibly more importantly, how is it impacting now on your life in the present? Linked hopefully with the final question, does it assist you at all? Perhaps this feeling of being on your guard, wanting to prove yourself, perhaps it drives you on to bigger and better things. Perhaps if you haven't worked quite so hard, maybe you wouldn't be in the chambers you're in today or the position you find yourself in. So thinking about those sorts of questions, perhaps capturing those questions if you want to come back to them immediately after the call, can help you get to the bottom of what it means for you currently. Because if there is one principle that I definitely believe in as a coach and trainer, it is that if something is not broken, do not go to the effort to fix it. So essentially here with those questions, what we're doing is identifying if it's worth dedicating some work to tackling this, how much time you want to put into that, and whether you want to work on the feelings, the narrative you're telling yourself, which we'll come on to, or whether you want to think more about the impact it has on you. So perhaps adopt a done is better than perfect approach. So recognise firstly, are you here just because it sounded like an interesting title, you didn't know what it was? Or are you here because you think this is holding you back? Or perhaps it's getting in your way of achieving some balance. Maybe you want to work on that idea of done being better than perfect and increasing your productivity. So have a think about those, and I'll move on fairly soon to a task with a couple of parts. And I think the wonderful thing about reflection, or getting into the habit of reflection, is that it will help you find your own solutions. My solutions might not be right for you. So this next task got a couple of purposes. I'll just get you to do a bit of thinking first. Now, the first thing that we ask you to do here is to make a list of the people whose opinions you respect and whose opinions matter to you. So this could be colleagues, pupil supervisors, heads of section, heads of chambers. It could be a partner, it could be a parent, it could be a good friend, it could be a lecturer, depending what stage you're at. Have a think about whose opinions you really respect, why you respect those opinions, and why their opinion matters to you. And the first part of this task, trying to talk slowly so you can have a think. The first part of this task is to encourage you, or perhaps seek to persuade you, that the size of the post-it note I'm holding up now, or very possibly, that is folded in half, that is one size bigger, so possibly that size of post-it note, should fit all the names of all the people whose opinion you are respecting, and certainly whose opinion you are allowing to impact on you. Maybe put those names on a post-it, maybe keep them somewhere in a wallet or a purse. And if you find yourself fretting about what that barrister you've never met before and never meet again, that judge you've never met before and will never meet again, if you find yourself worried about their opinion of you, ask yourself, are they on my list? That's my first question. Are they on my list? If they're not on my list, I'm not going to let their opinion, which I am in fact inventing through my non-existent mind reading powers most of the time, I won't let that imaginary opinion ruin my day. So the first purpose of this exercise, and the purpose of this slide, is to really narrow down the people whose opinions matter to you. Because I think feedback's important. I think getting the opinion of others is important. But if we are doing it through mind reading, or if we are giving credit to others who we don't really know their competence or whether we trust them or not, then that's probably not a great idea, is it? So narrow it down to the people whose opinions do matter, who you trust. And assuming that at least some of those people have knowledge of your professional ability, maybe they've signed you off as competent following pupillage, maybe they've recruited you to chambers, perhaps even returned work to you, or as a lecturer, maybe they've written a reference for you. The next thing to ask yourself is, how likely are all those clever, brilliant people, how likely is it that they are wrong about you? How likely is it that in my very lovely former chambers, full of competent people, full of people giving up their time to do interviews at a weekend, and with admin teams to support them, how likely is it that they tick the wrong button? There is a quote, I edited it for tonight's purposes, but there is a quote from Jodie Foster when she won an Oscar, saying that she spent nights thinking somebody was going to knock on the door and ask for the statuette back. Well, the Oscar committee have done it once, I suppose, haven't they, with the wrong envelope debacle. But it is likely that you have found yourself on a bar course and or in a chambers because clever people relying on evidence in front of them have determined that to be appropriate. And a slightly more challenging framing of that is, how rude are you to just disregard what they think? You've got a limited list of people you want to trust, you want to listen to. And then what? You think you know better? You think that not even you, but that voice of that tiny imposter in your head, you think they know better than your head of chambers? Than the head of the recruitment committee? Than a lecturer in a university? Not very likely, is it? So try to bring yourself back to that evidence. And I will just as an aside say that thinking about whose opinion you trust when we think about opponents, judges, instructing solicitors, etc. I'm a big believer that the way we learn at the bar, often learning from others, often taking in somebody's submissions, either in the case you're in or the case before that, that's brilliant way to learn. But I would always, bearing in mind Dunning-Kruger, confidence and competence and the potential for confusion between the two, always apply a degree of judgment to that. Don't think that just because somebody has more years on you, they are necessarily a better advocate and or that's necessarily a better technique that they're using. So absolutely give weight and respect to the opinion of people who you have determined matter and who have obviously found exercised good judgment in the past. But exercise your own judgment on that going forward also. Okay. So again, I'll move on from that because I want to share the other things with you as well. But do have a think about what from that you want to work on. I think what I'll do at the end of the hour is ask each of you privately to make a commitment to do one of these things, perhaps in the next week or so. Now, the next one is quite a challenging exercise, I think full stop. It's particularly, I know it's challenging because I've done it in real life, I suppose, is what I'm saying there. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and we'll only get to start it, but I do want to start it together. Obviously, I'm just trusting that you're playing along, but I want to start it together because it is almost invariably met with resistance. And I'd like us just to get over that resistance, stumble, and at least make a start on this. So my theory is, my premise is, you've been charged with being an imposter. It's a very serious case of fraud. It's going to be in the Crown Court, so serious. And I'm asking you to consider personally, as the defendant, what evidence you would call upon to support your defence, that you're good enough, that you deserve to be where you are, that you are competent, maybe even very competent. And the challenge is that no evidence will be admitted unless you get to the bottom of an A4 page in normal handwriting or type. And what that page needs to contain is your strengths, your achievements, academic or otherwise, prizes perhaps. And you can include witnesses who would give evidence on your behalf if you can summarise what they would say about you. Was a dedicated, hardworking junior tenant, for example. Okay. So it may be that some of you are looking at a blank piece of paper. It may be that some of you are thinking, this is horrible. I don't want to even write down good things about myself. That's not how I was brought up. That's not what we do. Just write a few, and I will trust you, and then I will move on. It's surprising sometimes. Sometimes people get really into this. And again, it might be one for you to pick up at 6:30. I think it's especially lovely to think about who would give evidence on your behalf, who would speak up for you. It's quite linked to what I'm going to talk about next. But it is good to know that you have, I was going to say resources, it sounds a bit mean to call people resources, but having a good team around you, having people you can call on the bad days when you feel like you're in the wrong job is really, really valuable at the bar. So think about who would give that evidence for you. Perhaps some of you will share this experience, and I think one of the loveliest things that happened to me, I think maybe it happened twice. Yes, it did happen twice, was when either a judge or an opponent took the time and the trouble to write to my head of chambers to say that I'd done a good job on that particular case. And even just saying that out loud to you feels a bit odd. So I share your pain with this blank piece of paper, but do push yourself. I'm going to assume each of you has got over some initial resistance, hopefully by now. And all I would add to that really is 2 pointers that might help with other topics. So one is that if you finish this, you will have, at the very least, one document that you can turn to, just like those people in bad times or in dark days, a document filled with evidence that you have come up with on a good day, on a day when you were pushed to do so. You will also have a document that you can add to and update so that your current and future achievements are not lost. And if I just show the next slide. Some of you might have heard of this before. It comes with many different names in the world of personal and professional development. I quite like brag file. Some might call it an achievements file. It can be a physical file, like on the photo, or it could be a folder in your inbox, a folder on your desktop. And the idea is that if you achieve something, you add it in, just as an entry. Could be an open working document like the one you've just started. You add those achievements to it, and the very, very valuable thing about it, I think, is that you can also, if it's a folder, for example, you can forward emails to it. So when you get emails from solicitors or perhaps forwarded from lay clients, add them to this, because you will forget them. I think one of my major reflections on leaving the bar was to look back and recognise that when I had won cases, I practised in civil law, and I practised mostly as a defendant, personal injury. When I won a case, I would walk out of court, I would head back to chambers, and I would talk about how great the judge was, or how great the witness was, how great the expert was, what a lucky day we'd had. Whereas if I lost a case, I would take all that blame on me. Then it wasn't down to the judge or the witness. That was down to me in my head at that time. So I think one of the brilliant things about having a brag file or a folder is that it gives you something to go to on those dark days, and it builds up as evidence that you're in the right place, doing the right thing. Also, as you gradually overcome all the obstacles in your way and you want to apply for silk in the future, whatever it might be, you've got a starting point there. Because believe me, when you've not filled in an application for 14 years and you go and try to do something a bit different, it's a bit annoying when you start from scratch. And then finally, before I move on to the last set of ideas I want to share with you, I will just say that if you are ever feeling stuck and you're not sure what's going on, what's holding you back, then that idea in this exercise that you should get to the very bottom of the page, that you should really push yourself, can come into unstick your thinking. So for example, one of the first things I will ask clients when they start to work with me is list 6 things you are tolerating. And the difference is, if you were to just say that, what are you tolerating at the minute? It's very easy for people to just say, oh, nothing really, everything's fine. If you say to people, what could you do to improve things? Oh, I don't know really. So 2 of my favourite questions are, what 6 things are you tolerating at the minute? And what 3 things, if you change them, would make the biggest difference to your life? Okay. And then the last sort of set of ideas to think about is about shifting your own narrative. I've credited a book there. It's called Shifting Stories by Andrew Scott, who's a coach who works a lot in higher education and has written a book on this. And the premise is we tell ourselves stories. I'm not good enough. I was recruited by mistake. I will be found out. They will take back my degree. Maybe I never should have got that maths A level. And Andrew's idea is that we can change that story. One idea I came across when I was thinking about this actually was just to change the voice of that story in your head. I did learn recently that not everybody has an internal monologue. Mine is non-stop, but for those who do, and if it's that voice saying you're not good enough, you're going to be found out, they'll realise you're not good enough for that case, then recognize that that is not you speaking, that is not logical evidence speaking, it's not the people whose opinions you value speaking, it is the voice of your fears. So once you recognize that, you can challenge it, recognize them as an imposter's voice, and perhaps transform them into a silly voice and ignore them completely. I love that idea. And I have started to try to make that work. When I hear that voice, I try and minimize it, make it sound a bit silly. But thinking also about the stories we tell ourselves, I think it is valuable to recognize we can change those stories. It's not easy. It's not a switch that you can just flick. It's a process. But the idea behind these next few slides is that you can take certain steps to make changing that story a bit easier. And the first slide that you can hopefully see now is thinking about what's the current story. What are you telling yourself? Not good enough for this set, not good enough for a traditional chancery practice, not good in a courtroom, only good on paper. What is it you're telling yourself? And then give that story a name. Don't aim for a very inspiring story if you don't like it, or inspiring title if you don't like the story, but maybe name it just so it's easier to shift it. And importantly, ask yourself, is that story okay with you? What is that voice saying? And then you can think about how to shift it. So what would be the most helpful alternative story? What's it called? Does it feel better? Could it feel better? Would it be better in the long term? Is it okay with you? What evidence do you need to believe in this new alternative story? Who else could support the new story? How could you document it? Would it be lovely, fabulous Hollywood moving images this time instead of a silly voice? And always important, if you make any change, to work out how you will celebrate success. So for now, just before I move on to the next slide, maybe just think what the new story would be called. You might want to go big, the best barrister in Manchester. You might want it to be Cath's Path to Silk. What is that new story's title? The idea of finding or uncovering the real you often comes up when people share this. I'm not going to require anyone to share it, but just think, if I could write a new story for myself, and I can, what would it be? Do feel free to share any inventive titles. And then I just want to share a couple more things. So would welcome anything you want to add to this slide in the chat or the comments. Let me just move that on. This was Nazrine's just raised that as well. What have you done to stop your imposter getting in your way? And what tips could you offer to others? So sometimes people talk about affirmations. You might talk about your body language, your posture, your power poses, maybe. Not a massive fan of power poses, but I do think that just sort of sitting up and taking deep breaths can be incredibly helpful. And if you do look into, when I say power poses, I'm thinking about when you often see politicians standing with their hands on their hips and their legs wide stance. which when you read where that comes from is what you're meant to do before you go out into public and have your picture taken or make your speech. So from that point of view, I think thinking about your posture, your breath, thinking about your own power and strength, maybe think about your own strength in that sense, is great to do in the bathroom beforehand, in a private space beforehand. You don't need to go out and stand with your hands on your hips. Might be quite off-putting to people, but you can channel that power and that strength. And a really good thing to channel, I think, is past successes. So link back perhaps with the Bragg file, give yourself the evidence you can do this, give yourself the evidence you've done it before, maybe done something similar before, maybe even done something harder before, and carry that evidence with you. Oh, there's some great comments there. Acceptance that I think this way and it might not be true. I think that's definitely a tip. So accepting you think this way and accepting it might not be true. It's just something that's passing through. It's a thought process. It's not who I am. There's an expression that is often quoted from neuro-linguistic programming, which is the map is not the territory. We're layering interpretation onto reality often. So love that, Adriana. Thank you, or possibly Adriana. So have a think about those tips just to remind you. Main ones from me: reframe, see it as a badge of success, recognize that you're not on your own. That's probably linked with the acceptance, I think, isn't it? Create evidence of your brilliance, store it and add to it. Remember to trust certain opinions, but only the opinions of certain people. I'll share a quote with that later. And recognise it can be a good thing not to be overconfident, not to be getting beyond your own competence, perhaps. So we'll perhaps come on to those. Oh, here's another tip. Imagine people attending your funeral. What nice things would they say about you? And add them to your witness list if you've got some examples there. Brilliant. So I know it's nearly time for questions, so I'll just share a couple of quotes to offset the quotes from before, because obviously neither Michelle Obama nor Brenda Hale nor anybody else have let this get in their way. So what Michelle Obama said is, my advice to young women is that you have to start by getting those demons out of your head. The questions I ask myself, am I good enough? That haunts us, because the messages that we are sent from the time we are little is, maybe you're not. Don't reach too high. Don't talk too loud. She said that was true for women, working class people, profound for women of colour, as people in power tried to make them feel they didn't belong. And then this last paragraph I think is really interesting, especially given who it comes from. Here is the secret. I have been at probably every powerful table you can think of. I've worked at non-profits. I've been at foundations. I've worked in corporations, served on corporate boards. I've been at G summits and I've sat in the UN. They are not that smart. So that's why I mentioned earlier, don't just copy every confident barrister you see. Don't just take on board their style. Reflect, apply some judgment. And I quite like that cynical approach. If it works for you, look around and realise how rubbish everyone else is. The slightly softer take, I suppose, is that to a degree, everyone's doing the best they can with what they've got. Nobody's born brilliant. Nobody's born with unending confidence, or perhaps they're not born with the two together, maybe. So do apply that realistic lens. Who are they good at? Who's good at what? Apply that to others as well as yourself. This is one of my absolute favourites and really goes with my post-it point. This is attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt, I think. You wouldn't worry so much about what others think of you if you realised how seldom they do. Everybody's too busy worrying about their own stuff. Everybody's too busy worrying about whether they're in the right place or not, to worry about whether you are. And then I thought I would give the last word to Brenda Hale as I gave the first word. The main thing is that you simply cannot let it stop you doing what you actually know you really can do, or at least think you can do, or assume you can do it until someone does find you out. Why not? Well, why not indeed? Keep trying until they do find you out, because they won't. Is very clearly the subtext there, isn't it? And then finally, I've just stuck my contact details on there. Hopefully we'll get that to you. It's skillfulconversation.com. I've got a newsletter where I'll share some tips quite sporadically. Also on LinkedIn, and for Herbal members, there's an offer on coaching sessions there that I think will be shared afterwards as well. So I'm going to just turn to the questions I can already see, and then I'll ask Rach to come in if there are any more. Nazreen has asked, how important do you believe it is to have sufficient downtime to recalibrate? And I find it's important to strike a balance between hectic days in court and taking a day out. Yeah, I think that works both ways, actually. I think building in some variety, if you can, is very healthy for the brain, for your well-being. I noticed yesterday I was getting nothing done, and it wasn't just the heat. It was that I've been working at home at the weekend and on Monday, and I needed to go out and see people. So I think tuning in to where you're up to, what would make things better for you. That's working outside, whether it's booking a day out, whether it's having a day, just have some thinking time. I think one of the big things I'd love to change at the bar is it's do. And as you've probably gathered, I'm quite passionate about pausing and reflecting, and whatever you can do to build that in is a real positive, I think. So yeah, absolutely. There's another tip as well for people, is to recalibrate also.
Cath, thank you so much. I also have a question. Something really resonated with me when you were presenting there about losing at court, and when you lose, you take everything in as if you solely were the person responsible for that, and when you don't really necessarily reward yourself or give yourself the credit. There is, I suppose, a balance though, would you say, in terms of, I suppose, part of it is reflecting and making yourself better and thinking, okay, I did actually get that a little bit wrong, or I could have done that better. And how do you try to balance that so that you are constantly progressing, but you're not getting bogged down in the criticisms, I guess, is probably my question.
Yeah, I think you've got to do both. You've got to bring in both the positive and the learning, or the positive and the negative. I don't mind the spade is a spade approach, but it is about learning, isn't it? And I think for me, what I do with coaching sessions is at the end, after the person has gone, I just do myself a page with a line down the middle, and I put what went well down one side, what I could improve down the other. And what people often miss is the what went well. So I absolutely think reflection and feedback are essential for development, for building confidence, for getting you to the place you want to be. But I think what we miss is the what went well. So if you're already doing half of it, just try and add the other half in. What was it that went well? It might have been your prep. It might have been the way you had fact managed your use of notes or references. It could be anything, but if you don't capture what you're doing well, you're relearning that every time as well.
This is hitting home quite severely with me.
It's not confession, right? You know.
It's fine. I'm happy to do it. Another question, there's one that's also popped in the chat, but just while I'm on screen, you talked about rewarding yourself and kind of celebrating those successes. Could you give some examples of things that you maybe used to do to do that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I was very good at it at the bar, and I will own up to that. It was more a sense of, I've got to the end of the week, maybe I can get a takeaway. It was that kind of thing. It wasn't necessarily the healthy stuff. And I genuinely think, I suppose what I do now has some parallels in that I do run my own business on my own. And I noticed that I was, I'd win a contract and I think, oh, that's amazing. And then I'd just move on and do the next thing. And I didn't even stop and really acknowledge it or enjoy it. So I think part of it is the pausing to enjoy. For me, I think sharing it with people in a similar position. So certainly when I was a pupil, my cohort, I shared it with. Now I've got small business owners who I will connect with and we'll share our successes. And sometimes that's enough, really, is the black and white. I do sometimes as well, and I think this is certainly was common with my colleagues at the bar, is there's a bit of if I get 3 more new clients, maybe I'll buy that necklace or that kind of thing. So sometimes it is a real physical acknowledgement, but I think probably what's more important is the actual recognition and making it go into the brain, making it go into your experience instead of just brushing over it.
No, really, really good tips there. It's about pace, I suppose, as well, which feeds into a lot of questions that we've had about balance and taking the time to reflect on things. Sometimes you just need to slow down, I think, is what I'm picking up.
Yeah. And I think as well, what I'd love people to take on at the bar in general is you are not your most productive if you just race through day to day, saying yes to everything, all of that. So you're much more productive if you take the breaks. You're much more productive if you look after yourself. You're much more productive if you take some time out for some development and some confidence. So you perhaps feel that those, 12, 15-hour days are a good thing. Whereas maybe 8 hours, but with really productive work and regular breaks, would actually be just as good, if not better.
Excellent. We have probably time for one more question, which has popped in from someone watching on YouTube. So, can you give some examples of positive affirmations, please, Cath?
I think the key word there is positive. So, for example, you wouldn't use something like "I'm not an imposter," because there's some evidence, I'm no scientist, but there's some evidence that your brain and your subconscious doesn't hear the not. So always try and make your affirmations positive in language. I am good enough. I deserve to be here. I am an excellent barrister. Could you get that far? I'm an excellent barrister. I'm excellent at what I do. Those kind of, so make the wording positive. Don't include any negatives in there. Flip it to make it a positive. And then what makes them most effective, this is like cop-out answer, but what makes them most effective is what's important to you. So for example, rather than saying I'm a great barrister, if you're nervous before a trial, you might want to go instead with I'm a competent advocate. Present tense as well. So present tense and positive language, and then what's important to you.
Amazing. Well, I know I'll be doing the shower tomorrow morning.
Brilliant. And do remember, everybody, we'll probably have to finish shortly, but please, before you go back to real life or make your meal or do whatever, set yourself one little challenge out of all of those we've talked about and just make a small change, because the small changes really add up.
Amazing. Cath, thank you so much. I personally have taken so much away from this webinar. I know that people watching on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, and the lovely people in our studio have as well. I think that brings this webinar to an end. You have Cath's details on the screen in front of you now, skillfulconversation.com, and you can also email her as well. And as Cath mentioned, she's giving a fantastic discount to any Her Bar members of 10% on coaching packages. So we'll be sending out some communications via our mailing list. So if you want to know more about that, get online, go to her bar, and we will send all that information out to you. Thank you so much for joining us. We've had a lot of great comments, and wishing you all a good evening. Don't melt. Thanks very much, Cath.
Thank you.